You probably already know that you shouldn't be using tables to style and build out your pages, but every once in a while you'll need to use a table, especially when you're presenting tabular data. Tables can be challenging because by themselves they don't act responsively. Here's an example of our final project that we're going to be creating in this lesson, and you can see that I'm comparing different sorts of sharks and giving information about them. When I resize my browser window, the table scales down, and at a certain point I reach a breakpoint when the table totally changes. So this is how my table would look on a small mobile device. The table would not accurately present the information in the column type of view that we had in the original design, but at a smaller design it makes sense to have the information display in this way. And this is just one solution on how you can work with tables. You may find other ways to deal with them, but this is a good way to start. So this is going to be the project that we're working on. Our starting file looks like this, and the information is in a table, and by default the table kind of acts responsively until a point, but then you can see at a certain point I will get horizontal scroll bars, and that's just because I have so many columns that my content can no longer fit within the width that I have here. What we're going to do is we're going to take a quick look at the starting HTML and CSS, and then we'll jump in and start to create this file. Here's the file that we're starting with, and it's based on a file that we've been using in previous lessons. There is some new items in here. Let's take a quick look at the HTML to begin with. Inside the HTML, I simply have the section that wraps around everything. Within that, there's a header that contains the headline and the header graphic. Then I have a table tag, and the table tag contains my table information. So I have a head row here, table head, and then I have the table body, which contains a series of rows with table cells, and each table cell contains an image, the title of the specific shark, the scientific title of the shark, and then additional information about the shark. So you can see that these are all set up in exactly the same way. So once again, here's our headers right here, common name, scientific name, and as we go down the columns we get the details about those specific things. The CSS that I have, I don't actually have any CSS on the table at all, so the table has not been formatted. So we'll go ahead and we'll begin by adding some generic CSS so that we can style our table and start to format it in the way that we want. I have a comment here that is designating just generic code for my table, so I'll begin by adding some generic content in for my table. I'm going to make a rule for the header cells and the regular cells in the table, and we'll select TD and TH, and this is going to create the basic table formatting. I'm adding padding, I'm adding a border around the edges, text align left, and I'm just going to vertically align the content to the top. So if we refresh in the browser, our table just starts to look more like a table. The next thing that we'll do is we'll create a little bit of zebra striping, and this will allow the content to display in a way that will make every other row a slightly different color. So I'm using the nth of type odd to target every other row. If we save now and we look in the browser, you can see that every other row now has a slightly different color. And this is going to continue to function in this manner at the small or large size. Now what we're going to do is we're going to create some specific styles for how we want the table to look at the larger size. At the larger size, I want the headers to actually stand out a little bit more and be slightly different color. So let's add that in right now. We already have a rule, a media query rule for our large screen size right here. So I'll include these new rules within this specific area. I'm going to make a rule on my table headers and set the background color to a dark gray, the text color to white, and the font weight to bold. Then on the larger screens, if we look, because of the font size, some of the content gets very, very narrow. So on the large screens, I'm going to reduce the font size as well. So we'll just make a rule for TD and TH, and we'll scale the font size down 85%. Now when I refresh in the browser, the font size is a little bit smaller and it's easier to read the information that we're presenting here. I'm going to collapse the borders by using a border collapse rule on my table. So I'm going to add a new selector for table, and I'm going to use border collapse. And when I do this and we look at the table, you can see that it just ends up creating thin lines, which is more along the lines of what I'd like. And then finally, I have some small images of the sharks, and I would like those to be a little bit bigger when my table is maximized. So we're going to use a selector of TD first child, and I'll specify my width to be 100%. Now when we look in the browser, the images take up a little bit more room at the largest size. They're still going to scale down, but at the full size screen, which is what I'm most concerned about, they're big enough to visually see what they are. When I get down to my mobile size, you can see that they shrink down to teeny tiny, and that's okay. We're going to solve that in just a moment. So because of some of the rules that I'm going to be doing, I want to force the table to not really behave like a table at the mobile version. What I want to have happen is I don't want all of those columns to be displaying. So I'm going to force my table to not behave like a table by setting every table-related element to be block level. So I'm going to use a selector that is going to encompass all of the elements within my table. But before I do that, I need to set up a media query that is going to target all screen sizes that are less than a certain width. So I'm going to use a media query for media only screen and max width 760. So all screens that are less than 760 are going to be affected by this set of rules. Within here, the first rule that I'm going to use is I'm going to set the table, the th head, the t body, the th, the td, the tr to all display as block level. And because I'm protecting this rule within the media query, it's not going to affect our large screen size. So if we come here, you can see that this immediately changes the layout of the table within the small size view so that the table columns now become stacked. And if I resize, you can see that the content is going to display up. Now obviously some of our content is not displaying quite the way we want because we have our column names at the very top and they only display once, and then we get down to the bottom where we have the picture of the shark and then the specific information about that particular shark. What I really want to do here is I want to hide the table headers and not display, but I don't want to totally hide them for accessibility purposes, so I'm just going to position them so that they're displayed off the screen and that the user will never see them at the small size. To do that, we're going to target T head TR. We're going to position them absolutely and give them a very high top and left value, something that you'll never see. So when we refresh in the screen, you can see that these names are now going to disappear. So now I just start with a picture of my shark, and then the description of that particular shark is going to continue on. So now what we want to do is we want these table cells down here to act like a row. I'm going to use some CSS3 to inject content that is going to create a two-column layout here, but it's going to be created through CSS. So the first thing we'll do is we'll make the TDs behave like a row. So we'll make a selector for TDs, and the rules that we're going to pass on are we're going to pass on a border of none except on the bottom, which I'm going to have a solid border, and I'm going to tell these to position relative, and I'm going to add a really large padding, a padding on the left, which is going to force the content to appear as though it's in a second column. Let's take a quick look at what this does to our page. You can see that now all of the content displays over on the right, and as I resize my screen, that's going to take up about 50% of the width of the table. As soon as we hit our breakpoint, of course, those stacked one column layouts change to the full size table. So we'll concentrate on our small table right now. What happens because of the colors that I'm using, I've lost my very subtle vertical lines that separates the information on the table rows that have the darker colored background. So to recover those, I'm going to add a rule that is going to allow me to style those to be a slightly different color. And again, I'll use some Css3 Selector. I'm going to use nth of type odd and pass on the TD. And then what we'll do here is we will set the border on the bottom of each of these cells to be 1 pixel solid and white. So if we save now and we look, you can see that I have a nice white vertical line that's going to separate the information within the zebra striping that we have with the darker colored background. Now we're going to use a Css3 selector so that we can create content that is going to appear on the page, and we're going to style it so that it acts like a table header. I'm going to use the selector of TD with the pseudo class of before, and then what we'll do is we'll add in some specific rules. I'm going to position the content absolutely. I'm going to have it display at a left location of 6 pixels, so it'll be indented 6 pixels from the left edge. I'm making the width 45% and I'm adding padding on the right. So before, our regular TDs had a padding left of 50%. Here I want to fill in the additional 50%, but because I'm using padding on the right, I had to make the width slightly smaller. I'm going to tell my white space to not wrap. That'll force all the content to stay on one line, and I'm going to structure the font weight to be bold. Now if we refresh, visually we're not going to see anything because there is no content that appears within this section. What we'll do is we'll use some CSS to label the data that we want to appear, and we're going to use nth of type selectors so that they will appear in the appropriate location. So I'm going to use a variety of selectors that are going to be specific to each table cell that displays, and it's going to create content that appears before that table cell. So I'm using TD nth of type 1, that's targeting my first table cell, and then before it's going to inject some content. For the very first one, that's going to display our picture of our shark, so I don't want anything to display. But for the second one, for instance, it's going to now display the content of name. So it'll actually generate this text and have it appear on the web page. So if we save and we preview, you can now see that I get these labels. This is what we had appearing in our table header before. Now we're generating this content to appear with CSS. So these labels now appear, and then the content is going to appear to the right. Now this is looking pretty good. I would like my shark to be aligned to the left though, so I'm going to make a specific rule to overwrite that padding on the left of 50% for the first table cell only. So we'll use a selector of TD nth of type 1, and I'm just going to tell it to have a padding on the left of none. Now when we save and we refresh in the browser, you can see that my sharks now appear left aligned, and then the content is going to flow after that. So this is looking pretty good. The only other thing that I want to do is when my page starts to get very small, very narrow, my text, especially where I have geographical location, crashes into the content. So at the very small screen, I actually want my text to get a tiny bit smaller. So we'll just use a media query to target that. I'm going to use a media query of @media screen and max width of 450. So this is going to only target screens that are less than 450 pixels, and we'll simply tell the TD and the THs to display with a font size of 85%. If we save now and we refresh, you can see that now we no longer have the crashing between the text, and this looks pretty great. So here is my very small size for my shark comparison chart, and as I size my screen up, it continues to flow, and then at a certain point I'm going to break into my large screen view. So this is an example of how you can create a responsive table with some CSS and media queries that will allow you to control and hook these things, and now my table becomes something useful. Without these media queries, I would not really be able to access this information very easily on a small device.